All right, so just to expound a little bit more, like I said, I wanted to talk to my mom and dad, but they wouldn't talk to me. And just like an interesting thing that happened was like probably around 2018, I posted some videos of me playing basketball, and my grandpa watched the video and he was like, "You started varsity as a freshman? You were starting point guard on varsity?" He was like, "Ronaldo didn't play on varsity?" And my grandpa was all confused because again, my grandpa never knew how good of a basketball player I was. His whole thesis was, "Oh, well, you started playing against bigger, better players, and you got frustrated, and you took it out on your dad, and your dad beat you up, and that's what happened in high school." No, that's not what happened. And it was just a shooting machine, and I was trying to fix my shot with the shooting machine, but my grandpa wanted to make me the bad guy, so he was a victim blamer, and he never knew how good I was. And he didn't know if it wasn't for the shooting machine how good I would have been. I hated that. I hated it because I knew that he looked down upon me, and I knew that he was false in his way he looked at me. And my mom, when I tried to talk to my mom about it, my mom would be like, "Well, no, you did. It wasn't the shooting machine. It was because you couldn't handle the pressure, and you lost it." And I wanted to talk to my dad, and I wanted to show him the videos. I could show the videos, so I told my grandpa, "I want to show you the videos and show you what happened to my shot. It was a shooting machine." My grandpa was like, "I'm not interested." But at the time though, my grandpa was like, "Well, you started on varsity as a freshman?" He was all confused, like, "What? You were that good?" And Ronaldo didn't even play varsity as a freshman. Ronaldo was a big basketball player. Uh, he ended up playing in the NBA a little bit, but his dad was an NBA player. But my grandpa was like, "What? I thought Ronaldo was way better than you." And he was like, he was confused because he didn't know how good I was. And that was my point was, he was like, "You're playing against bigger, better players." No, I was a starting point guard on varsity as a freshman. I wasn't playing against bigger, better players. I would have been the best if it wasn't for the shooting machine. I really do think so. I was considered one of the best players in the nation, and I was always improving. And even then, even at the time, like I was really good, but it was a shoot away machine that messed up my shot. But so my grandpa, but he wanted to make me the bad guy. And so another thing that my grandpa was doing was like, so, like I said, my grandpa's thing was like, well, oh, another thing that he said was like, "Well, Ryan, if you were in the flow, then even if you had a shoot away machine, it wouldn't have messed up your shot if you're in the flow." And I was like, "No, you don't know what you're talking about." But my grandpa's like, again, victim blamer. But my grandpa's like, "Well, what about Sean Marion? He had a weird shot, but he still could shoot." But I'm like, it's not about having a weird shot. It wasn't that my shot got weird. It was that I was stepping into it wrong, picking the ball off the rack, and I was the best shooter because of how my feet were. And my dad knew that. He told me, I'm not going to go into details, but he told me to shoot sideways. And yes, I shot good because I shot sideways, but it was how I moved into shots. And picking the ball off a rack, you can't do that. And I want to just explain this to my dad, and I want to explain it to my mom, and I want to show it to him. But my grandpa's like, "I'm not interested." And he just wanted to make me the bad guy, and I just wanted to explain this. So just to continue, my grandpa's like, his thing was like, "Well, if the Israelites weren't in the flow, then they wouldn't have been enslaved. And if they were in the flow, they wouldn't have been enslaved." And I'm like, well, this seems like victim blaming. And this is like this. And then around that time, like Kanye West was like, "Yeah, it seems like the black people want to be slaves, like they wanted to be slaves," and like the victim blaming type of thing. And it's like that idea, like, oh, so if you have bad things happen to you, it's because of you're not in the flow, right? And that's kind of what Dr. Hora, my grandpa got his PhD in psychology under Dr. Hora, but he's very new age. But my grandpa tried to make the new age very rationalistic. But Dr. Hora would be like, "Yeah, you kind of create your reality. Like, nothing comes into your experience uninvited. And like, if you're enslaved, it's because of something wrong with your thoughts. You have some sort of invalid thoughts. Or even if there's a storm, it's something with your thoughts." Like, and my grandpa liked this idea because my grandpa's whole thing was like, "Yeah, take responsibility for everything, because you can't change other people, but all you could do is upgrade your software." But at the same time, it's like, he'd also be like, though, well, you could, if you're in the flow, you can discern, like, again, like I said, people can overdo it and be like, "Yeah, well, people who are in, who have bad things happen to them, it's just because they like it, because they want it," really victim blaming. But my grandpa would be like, "Well, that's also dualistic software. Those types of people are expressing predator prey software toward the people who are victims and stuff." And, my grandpa, he had a more of a sophisticated way of looking at it. But regardless, when my grandpa would tell me, like, it's important to take responsibility, again, I would still see it as, like, kind of victim blaming, kind of right wing and white supremacist. But again, at this time in my life, 2016 to 2020, I had become a white supremacist kind of. I was right wing nationalist, and I liked Donald Trump. And I was like, but I thought, like, yeah, there is a race mixing type of thing. So, I was kind of against, kind of that way. But what's interesting was, I'll just give a few more examples of how that would manifest. Was my grandpa would be like, "Well, yeah, well, Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth, her name means seeker of truth, and she was a black lady, and she claimed to just walk away from slavery. And my grandpa was like, well, what her name means is to seek truth, and that's the flow, that's inquiry, expanding your awareness and stuff. And if you're in the flow, slavery can't hold you, and that's what Sojourner Truth did. She just walked away. So my grandpa's whole thesis was like, well, if you're in the flow, you're not going to be enslaved. If you're in the flow, you will just walk away from slavery. And again, I was like, in my mind, I'm like, no, that's like blaming the victim. That's white supremacy type of thing. And it's like, oh, so basically what you're saying is that if the black people would have just walked away, and if they've been in the flow, they would have not been enslaved. But my grandpa, his whole thing was like, well, like my grandpa didn't like activism because he thought activism was dualistic, right? Like, dualistic software, expression of dualistic software, ego-oriented. But, again, it's more complicated and complex. So he would say, like, sometimes, there is no formula to the flow. Sometimes if you're in the flow, that could work. But regardless, like, my grandpa was like, yeah, you don't want to fight against slavery. You don't want to be for it. You don't want to be against it. But if you're in the flow and you are transcended yourself, and you're in inquiry, and you're outside of yourself, and you're part of something larger than yourself, and you lose yourself, he says slavery cannot hold you. He said fighting it is not the answer. But and I remember, like, another thing is I played my grandpa a video on Uncle Tom, and my grandpa was like, well, he thought that originally Uncle Tom might have been, because there is a slave mentality where it's like you feel superior by being inferior, right? And my grandpa would say that's not the flow, but my grandpa was like, yeah, well, Uncle Tom might have been in the flow because Uncle Tom, he wasn't fighting against it, and he said, he might have lived a bad life, but in the next life, in his reincarnation, he might, he's not going to have difficulty in that life because he wasn't fighting, and he was more in the flow and everything. But again, like, that's what I hated about religion. It's like, oh, so you're justifying the slavery, and you're saying, well, he's going to have a good afterlife, which you don't have any evidence for. But it's like, that just maintains the status quo. And my grandpa believed in reincarnation, or he said that he was open to the idea. Again, he didn't believe anything. He's just his framework of understanding. But I didn't like the idea of reincarnation because it's like, oh, so you justify, my grandpa would be like, he didn't believe Darwinism was, or like genetics was the reason why people were born with great gifts. He thought it was possibly because of previous lives and stuff. But again, it's the idea that you take responsibility for everything. So if you're really great at piano in this life, it's because of your previous lives. So in a way, you're taking responsibility for it. Or if you're doing really bad in this life, it's because of your past lives in a way. Maybe you didn't have a head start because of your past lives. But again, I always saw that as like the white supremacist, victim blaming, maintaining the status quo, justifying the status quo by saying like, oh, it's past lives and stuff like that, right? And so when I was a leftist, remember, I believed in Darwinism, and I was like, no, it's survival of the fit. There's Darwinism, it's genetic Darwinism and stuff like that. And that's what religion is, basically. Religion is just genetic Darwinism, a way for the, white supremacy, like the Brahmins in India. They were the lighter-skinned Aryans, and they maintained religion in order to maintain the status quo and to maintain their genetic Darwinian power dynamics and stuff like that. And that's the way I saw religion. But my grandpa didn't see it that way. My grandpa was like, but I was asking my grandpa, so you don't believe in Darwinism? My grandpa's like, no. So I was like, okay, well then why is it that, women choose the alpha male? This is like 2018 when I'm asking, like, why do they choose the alpha male? But men and they're very picky, but men are not so picky, and they tend to have sex more. There've been studies on that. My grandpa was like, well, I don't think that that's Darwinism. I think that that's based off software. Because my grandpa's whole thing is, he would say, like, you transcend and include. So yeah, he said Darwinism might be operative, or instinctual stuff might be operative, but he would say ultimately, that is just settling or resigning to and justifying poor behavior, or not being on the flow and not being a beneficial presence. And my grandpa's an existentialist, and he doesn't want to blame genes and genetics, or even blame God or blame anything. He wants you to take responsibility for everything. And he kind of even liked the book The Secret, but my grandpa's very rationalistic. So Dr. Hora, who my grandpa learned under, he would be like, yeah, you do create your reality in a way. Like, your thoughts do create your reality. But my grandpa wanted to tone it down a little bit, and he'd be like, well, that doesn't really create it. But if you do have, more positive thoughts, and for instance, then you might be able to manifest good things better, because you're going to have a higher level of aliveness, and you're going to go after things more and stuff like that. So he would take it, the new age, to more of a rationalistic, naturalistic explanation, right, So it's kind of new age, but also naturalistic. But, my grandpa was like, but his whole thing was like, he kind of liked that idea of the secret, you create your reality, because it's like, well, yeah, it's important to take responsibility, and you can't change others, but all you can do is just work on yourself and upgrading your software. And now I hated that, because I thought that made my parents be like, yeah, Ryan, you can't change us. You just have to upgrade your software. But my grandpa would even say like, well, yeah, they have to upgrade their software too. They're expressing immature, stubborn, dualistic software in their right-wing orientation, right? So my grandpa's notions were more sophisticated and complex. He wasn't an idiot, right? But regardless, I don't think he helped very much, and he made things worse. But my grandpa would be like, so I asked him like, what do you think? You don't believe in Darwinism? And my grandpa's like, no, like, well, I'm like, well, why is it that the women are less picky, and the women are very picky, and they choose the best, and the men, they go after quantity over quality? And I was like, well, the reason is because that's how women, they choose the best genes, so they want the best alpha male, so because they can only have one child per 9 months, whereas the men, they can have as many child as they want, so they're not so picky, so they try to spread their seed as much as possible. So you see that phenomena in psychological studies, where men will, if a woman asks a man, do you want to have sex tonight, the man will say yeah. But if men ask, a handsome man asks a woman, do you want to have sex tonight, a random woman on the street, most of the time the woman says no. And I'm like, well, it's because it's Darwinism, because those are Darwinian strategies for producing offspring for future generations, and men and women have different they evolved, or whether it's evolved or not, they have different Darwinian motivations and different Darwinian strategies for that. But my grandpa was like, no, I don't believe it's Darwinism, because my grandpa did, again, you don't want to, you have to take responsibility for everything. So my grandpa's like, no, I think it's just software, and you could always upgrade your software, right? So he's like, and and so I was like, well, how, what do you mean? And see, I didn't really understand what he meant by software at this time. But then my grandpa's like, yeah, well, the woman, she has superior inferior software, and she wants to have the superior offspring. So she goes for the superior man, who she views as superior. Whereas the man, he feels a sense of superiority by having the most offspring. So he goes for as many women as possible. So he tried to take out the whole instinctual stuff. He always tried to take out the Darwinian instinctual stuff. But to me, in my mind, I was like, no, it is more instinctual. I don't think that it is so much like, but my grandpa's like, no, you don't want to resign to genetics and justify poor behavior on genetics. So again, like, I think that my grandpa was like a human potential guy. Like, rather than trying to seek the truth, he just wanted to be like, well, Ryan, this is, to be a beneficial presence, and I'll try to make you the best, the beneficial presence. And so it's like, he didn't really care about the truth, but it's more like, but regardless, I don't know if he really did believe this, but his whole thing was like, well, yeah, certainly there might be some Darwinian aspect of it, or instinctual aspect of it, but really don't want to resign to the instincts or blame that. You don't want to blame that. You want to upgrade your software, and you can upgrade your software past superior, inferior software, the desire to be superior, which is self-confirmatory, to the flow, and to be a beneficial presence. Now later he would teach me about the idea of beneficial presence, but he distinguished, because this is what Dr. Hora, his teacher, talked about. Dr. Hora talked about there's a difference between beneficial person, a beneficent person, and a beneficial presence. Because Dr. Hora would say, like, there is no person. Everything's an illusion, right? And he talked about more like a hologram and stuff. And my grandpa, he tried to make everything more naturalistic. Dr. Hora was more new age, and like, we're in a dream. But my grandpa was more very rationalistic and naturalistic, and that was his framework of understanding. He didn't believe it, because you don't want to believe anything, because then you're attached to your beliefs. But his thing was like, no, yeah, everything is one, so there is no person. You're not a beneficial person, you're a beneficial presence, because everything is one. And the idea is you want to like just be in the flow, and that's transcending all dualistic software. The delusion that there is yourself and another, which is dualism, and to be in the flow, which is like so like superior inferior software. Later he would teach me. It took him till like 2019 to teach me this. So at this time I didn't really understand what software was. So he would teach me like in 2019, like there's impersonal software, like predator prey, which is like the desire to prey on people, or like ally enemy, which is, if you do things for me, then you're my ally. If you don't, you're my enemy, and I'll hurt you. So those are impersonal because they're action oriented, and you might hurt the person. But then there's attitudinal, where it's just attitudinal, where it's like superior inferior, where you don't necessarily hurt the person, but you just have a sense of superiority. Or like insider outsider. Insider outsider could be action oriented or just attitudinal. It depends on if you perform action. So like the insider outsider could be action oriented if you try to push the person out of your group because he's not an insider, or, but that's dualistic because, you're still focused on the self. But eventually you can transcend that to, my grandpa would say cooperation, which is still dualistic because you're cooperating with others, but it's moving toward what my grandpa called mutual participation in the flow, where you transcend the self and you're just focused on the truth and inquiry. And, you transcend the ego, because now I understand, but at the time I didn't understand. Like when you're in the ego, you can't really see the truth because it distorts the truth, right? But then when I guess the idea is the flow is very objective because you transcended the ego. You've transcended the ego, which clouds your judgment and emotions and, all that, right? And you get to the truth. Now I understand that. But, but it took a long time for me to understand that. And only after I started reading Dr. Horace's books, because my grandpa never explained things well. But my grandpa was just confusing me. But his whole thing was, I felt like he was a victim blamer and stuff, but he basically, so he moved me away from the belief in Darwinism, because remember, when I was a Darwinist, I was a communist. I was anti-religion. I thought religion was just Darwinism, and I wanted to destroy religion. I wanted to mix the white people. But at this time, I started becoming more religious, and he was helping me with this. So I'm like, okay, so it's not Darwinism, it's software, and humans have the capacity to upgrade our software. And my grandpa was like, yeah, it's not Darwinism. My grandpa, again, he was like, it's the anti-entropic rewarding function. The reason why the woman wants the most high-quality man is because that's the way that the energy systems can upgrade. And life is an anti-entropic rewarding function in the universe because the universe is moving toward entropy, but life is synergy, and it's moving against the entropy of the universe. This is one of my grandpa's theories that he got from Buckminster Fuller. So my grandpa's like, yeah, and that's why, that's why you see the lion. I asked my grandpa, why does the male lion kill the baby lions? And he takes over the female pride, the lions of the other tribe or of the other men. And I said, it's Darwinism, because then he can have his genes move on to the next generation. My grandpa's like, no, it's because, he might have the most synergy. And then he mates with the women, so he kills the less synergistic lion, which is more entropy oriented. And then he has sex with the women, which is more synergy. With his more synergy, he has sex and he has babies. And then that's creating more synergy because his babies will be stronger. And that's just a part of the synergy of the universe, which is, and he believed that everything is evolving, kind of like Sri Aurobindo. My grandpa's very modernism, right? He didn't believe in a God. He thought that every God was energy, right? And he thought, believe in a God is magical thinking, but he did think that there was like an evolutionary movement toward what Sri Aurobindo or what Teilhard de Chardin talked about, like the omega point or the enrichment of the noosphere and a new stage in evolution. And that's the kingdom of heaven. So my grandpa's very like new age naturalistic, right? So I was like, so I'm listening to this, but it is moving me away from my, previous communistic, anti-white communism, anti-religious perspective. And now I'm becoming more religious. Like, okay, so if we just transcend dualistic software and there isn't Darwinism, but it's dualistic software, and we can be beneficial presences and, stuff like that. So, and then like just one other example though, which is kind of interesting, was but the thing about that I didn't like my grandpa was he seemed kind of leftist too, because again, like everything is energy, and like it seemed kind of anti-religion and anti-Christian because he didn't believe that Jesus was God, right? And I was anti, when I was a leftist and anti-white, I was anti-Christian because I thought that Christianity maintained the white race, and I wanted to destroy Christianity. But then my grandpa's confusing me, and he's like, because he seems a little bit anti-Christian, but at the same time, not so much, like, because he's very, like, he believes in Jesus, right? Dr. Horowitz very into Jesus, but he just thought that, Jesus was God, and that, God is energy. This is what my grandpa thought. God is energy, and everything is one. And Dr. Horowitz was very into Jesus, but, he saw it like, that everything's a dream, and Jesus was one with God, and that, he was like one with the consciousness, the infinite mind, or whatever, but very new age, right? But new age, like modernism and all that type of stuff. But so I was just like, but I kind of liked my grandpa's teaching because it was kind of anti-Christian when I was a leftist, right? But at the same time, like at this point, I was like, so I showed my grandpa a audiobook by C.S. Lewis, and in the audiobook, C.S. Lewis is talking about people like my grandpa, and he was like these new age people, the people who were like, he didn't use the word new age, but he was like the people who are like, who believe, like Teilhard de Chardin, who believe that God is energy and God is evolution of the universe toward, and he was like, those types of people, he said they can believe that God is energy and stuff, but then, then they can do whatever they want. And let's say they do kill people or they do have sex out of marriage and stuff, and they'll just be like, oh, whatever, it's not that big of a deal. God's just energy. Now, my grandpa did think that there was consequences, right? Like if you're not in the flow, you'll have more difficulty in the afterlife, which is called hell. because you're stuck to illusion that you are a separate self, and breaking free of the separate self is what they call hell, but regardless, my grandpa, so I showed that to my grandpa. My grandpa was listening to it, and my grandpa was like, that's an interesting idea by C.S. Lewis. My grandpa really liked C.S. Lewis, right? And I'll get to that. But he was like, that's an interesting idea. But my grandpa was like, but that's my framework of understanding. I don't believe that there is a separate God. Like, my grandpa didn't believe Jesus was God. He thought that God is energy, right? Or he didn't believe that there was a separate God. God is energy. And C.S. Lewis was like, no, the Bible says that there is a separate God. And, there's people who are like, God is energy, and like, it's evolution he said that they're just like, he didn't think that their system was fruitful, and it led to like, then they could just do whatever they want, because in their minds are just like, oh, it's just energy, right? So, but my grandpa thought that his theory was the most existentially valid and led to the best consequences, right? But again, my grandpa didn't believe it though, because if you believe it, then you're not in the flow, right? He wanted to be open to inspiration, so very new age, but also rationalistic and naturalistic, right? So, but I kind of wanted to go towards C.S. Lewis, because because I wanted to maintain Christianity, and I wanted to maintain religion, and I felt that my grandpa's idea that everything's just energy might lead to race mixing. And at this time, I was like against race mixing. And it's interesting because I listened to an audiobook where they're like, yeah, the German mystics, so my grandpa's German, and these like mystics, their ideas end up leading to race mixing, because it's like, oh, everything is energy, and it just like destroys religion. It leads to race mixing, right? So it's like, at this time I was a right-winger nationalist, and I was against race mixing, and I wanted to maintain religion. So I wanted to kind of go more toward C.S. Lewis and be like, well, there is maybe a separate God, and maybe my grandpa is wrong, whether it's Jesus or whether it's what the J Witnesses believe in the Tetragrammaton, or maybe it is a separate entity, and it's not just energy. Like, and I knew that the quadrant model, there is a supernatural component, but my grandpa didn't believe the quadrant model. He's like, that's magical thinking. My grandpa didn't believe in gematria. He didn't believe in that stuff. He thought that was magical thinking, but I knew that stuff was real, because I'd been studying it, and I knew that there was a supernatural aspect of reality. But my grandpa didn't believe that. He's like, oh, no, I think everything's energy. My grandpa didn't believe in synchronicities. He didn't believe in that type of stuff. He didn't believe I saw reality as more like a dream. And that's even what Dr. Hora, my grandpa's teacher, thought. But my grandpa's like very naturalistic and very rationalistic. And I don't know if a part of it was because, remember, when I was anti-religion, I made fun of my grandpa for believing that Jesus could turn bread turn the air to bread and stuff, because I was anti-religious. And like, I thought that my grandpa just wanted to believe that because he wanted to maintain the status quo, and he wanted, because he was a feeler, and he wasn't very rationalistic. And I kind of made fun of my grandpa, and maybe my grandpa was trying to be very rationalistic, but he still believed that Jesus could do that stuff. But he tried to make it rationalistic, like, well, it's not magical though. I don't believe in magic. I think it's just that everything is energy, and you can manipulate the energy. And Jesus was able to manipulate the energy because he was really in the flow. So, regardless, like, is new age mixed with naturalism, and I didn't think it was accurate though, because I knew the quadrant model. I knew there was a supernatural component. I thought like maybe there is a separate God, like, but my grandpa, he was like averse to that idea, right? So I was just like, yeah. So this is kind of what's going on at that time in 2018. But again, like, I become more right winger, and my grandpa was moving me more toward that, because he was moving me away from the my old believing in Darwinism and believing that religion was bullshit and trying to destroy religion and mix the races and being anti-white and communist. And my grandpa was teaching me more like right-wing stuff. And I'll get more into that, like his stuff on Forrest Gump, and I'll talk about that in the next lecture.